David and Claire's marriage had always seemed unbreakable, until the day Claire discovered the shocking truth about her husband's secret affair with a local news anchor. What started as an innocent professional connection spiraled into a web of lies, betrayal, and ultimately tragedy. Now, as David faces the consequences of his actions, Claire must decide how far she's willing to go to heal from the devastating blow to her heart. Their story is a chilling reminder that even the strongest relationships can crumble when trust is shattered beyond repair. David and Claire Jones were the picture of suburban bliss, living in a cozy home with their 2 children in a quiet neighborhood, where everyone seemed to know everyone else's business. David was a well-known television director, praised for his work in the entertainment industry. Claire, his devoted wife, worked as a high school teacher, beloved by her students for her warmth and dedication. To anyone looking in, they were the kind of couple you'd envy, successful, good-looking, and perfectly content. But as with many seemingly perfect lives, things weren't as flawless as they appeared. David's career was demanding. He spent long hours at the studio, often traveling to oversee shoots in different cities or working late into the night on edits and productions. Claire, on the other hand, was grounded in their family life, taking care of their children and managing the home. At first, their busy schedules seemed manageable, but as time wore on, David's absences grew more frequent, and the quiet distance between them started to feel more permanent. Claire tried to ignore the creeping feeling of unease that came with David's late nights and unexplained absences, convincing herself that this was simply a phase. After all, David had always been a hard worker, and she admired his dedication to his craft. However, the distance between them wasn't just physical. At home, David had become distant and distracted. He would spend his evenings glued to his laptop checking emails or making phone calls long after their children had gone to bed. Claire began to notice the subtle changes in him. His once affectionate demeanor was replaced by coldness, and the warmth in their conversations had dimmed. He no longer seemed interested in their conversations about their kids or their plans for the future. Every day Claire tried to hold on to the remnants of their connection, but it became increasingly difficult. Yet Claire couldn't pinpoint the reason for the change. There were no obvious signs of another woman, no glaring signs of betrayal, but her instincts, the same ones that had guided her in her career as a teacher, whispered that something was wrong. It wasn't that David was ever openly unkind or dismissive. He was simply absent. It was the absence that stung the most, the emotional distance that Claire couldn't bridge no matter how much she tried. Their conversations became shallow, revolving only around the children, the bills, and daily life, with little room left for intimacy or connection. David, on the other hand, found himself in a different world. As the months went by, the pressures of his work began to weigh heavily on him. While at the studio, his eyes met those of Laura Grant, the station's newest news anchor. Laura was everything Claire was not: bold, charismatic, and effortlessly glamorous. She had the kind of personality that commanded attention, and her on-air presence was magnetic. David admired her from afar, at first finding her charm refreshing, a break from the mundane. It was innocent enough, just a mutual respect between 2 professionals. Or so David told himself. But as the weeks passed, their casual conversations turned into longer chats during coffee breaks, then private meetings after work. There was something about Laura's presence that excited David, something that made him feel alive again in ways he hadn't felt in years. What started as innocent flirtation quickly spiraled into something far more complicated. The emotions he'd buried beneath the surface for so long suddenly surfaced in full force. And with those emotions came a dangerous temptation, one that David didn't know how to resist. His growing obsession with Laura began to cloud his judgment, making him forget about the woman he had married and the life they had built together. As he and Laura spent more time together, David began to justify his actions to himself. Claire had been distant too, right? She didn't seem to notice his growing frustrations, or if she did, she didn't know how to fix things. Maybe, David thought, it wasn't such a big deal. After all, he was a good husband, wasn't he? But in the back of his mind, he knew the truth. He was walking a dangerous line. What had once been an innocent flirtation was now threatening to unravel everything. The affair was only just beginning, but its repercussions would go far beyond what David could have ever imagined. David's relationship with Laura Grant began innocently enough, a simple connection between two professionals who shared a mutual respect for one another. Laura, a rising star in the local news scene, had an energy about her that was hard to ignore. Her beauty was undeniable, but it was her confidence, her ease in front of the camera, and her quick wit that captivated David. He found himself drawn to her, not just as a colleague, but as someone who made him feel alive again, someone who was a stark contrast to the growing emptiness he felt in his marriage. It started with small exchanges, light-hearted conversations after meetings, casual chats about work, and laughs over lunch. David admired Laura's ambition, the way she could hold an audience's attention with nothing more than a few words. It was a stark difference to Claire's quiet, stable world, where conversations often revolved around their children or their home, with little room for excitement or spontaneity. David's admiration for Laura gradually turned into something deeper, something that began to pull at him in ways he couldn't control. They would stay after work for drinks, talking about their lives, their dreams, their frustrations. Laura would smile at him in ways that made his heart race, and he would catch himself thinking about her long after their conversations ended. What started as a professional friendship soon evolved into something far more dangerous. David tried to keep the relationship under control. He told himself that it was just a fling, just harmless fun. He was still married after all, still living, with Claire and their children. But as the days went by, the lines between friendship and something more blurred. Laura's flirtations became more overt, and David found himself reciprocating, despite the nagging feeling in the back of his mind telling him that this wasn't right. It wasn't long before their casual meetings turned into secret rendezvous. They would meet in hotel rooms, exchanging stolen moments of passion, both of them caught up in the intensity of their affair. Meanwhile, back at home, Claire remained oblivious to the changes in her husband. She noticed that David was becoming more distant, spending more time away from home, but she assumed it was just the demands of his job. She never suspected that there was another woman involved. Claire's love for David was unwavering, and she trusted him completely. He was her partner, the father of their children, the man she had built a life with. How could she possibly imagine that he was capable of betraying her? But David's secret was starting to take its toll on him. The guilt was eating away at him. But at the same time, the thrill of the affair made him feel alive in a way he hadn't felt in years. Laura became his escape from the monotony of his marriage, his lifeline to a world outside the confines of family and responsibility. The more he saw her, the less he felt tethered to his life at home. He justified his actions, telling himself that Claire didn't need him the way Laura did. Claire was wrapped up in her own world, in her teaching and in the routine of their everyday life. She hadn't noticed the changes in him, hadn't questioned why he was coming home late or spending less time with the children. David's feelings for Laura deepened with every passing day. He began to imagine a future with her, one where he could be free from the responsibilities of marriage, a future where he didn't have to hide his true desires. But even as his heart pulled him further into the affair, he couldn't shake the guilt that would surface during quiet moments. There were nights when he would lie awake in bed beside Claire, feeling her warmth and hearing her steady breathing, and wonder how he could ever look her in the eye again. But the next morning the guilt would fade as he thought of Laura, and the cycle would begin anew. David had crossed a line, and while he could still tell himself that it was just an affair, just a temporary escape, deep down, he knew that the consequences would be far more severe than he could ever imagine. The affair was no longer just a secret. It was a ticking time bomb, and it was only a matter of time before everything would come crashing down. Claire had always prided herself on being observant, on noticing the little things that others might overlook. She had a sixth sense when it came to people, a trait that had made her a successful teacher and a supportive partner to David. But in the past few months, it felt like that intuition was growing sharper, more insistent, as if the world around her was trying to tell her something she didn't want to hear. It began subtly, the cracks in their marriage. First, it was the late nights. David had always been busy with work, but now it seemed like his time at the office stretched endlessly into the night. Claire would sit up late, waiting for him to come home, only to fall asleep on the couch, her mind racing with thoughts of where he could be. Sometimes she would hear him come in quietly, as if trying not to wake her, and she would pretend to be asleep, hoping he would say something, anything, to acknowledge his absence. But he never did. His excuses became routine. Another late meeting, more editing, another project deadline. She wanted to believe him, wanted to trust him the way she always had, but something in her gut told her that things weren't as simple as they seemed. Then there were the small details, the ones that only Claire would notice. The way David had become more distant, more withdrawn when they did spend time together. Their conversations had become shallow, their connection frayed. He no longer asked about her day, her students, or the things she cared about. It was as if he was present, but not really there, a stranger in his own home. And when they did talk about their children, there was a sense of detachment in his voice, as if he was just going through the motions. Claire didn't know what had changed, but it felt like the man she had once known, the man she had fallen in love with, was slipping further away with each passing day. It was one evening when Claire stumbled upon the evidence that her instincts had been screaming about for months. She had been tidying up the house, putting away the laundry, when she found David's phone on the kitchen counter, carelessly left behind. He never used to leave it lying around, always keeping it within arm's reach, so the fact that it was sitting there felt wrong. At first, she hesitated, knowing that violating his privacy was a betrayal in itself. But the curiosity gnawed at her, the feeling that something wasn't right overpowering her sense of guilt. With trembling hands, she unlocked his phone. The messages on the screen hit her like a punch to the gut. The words were casual at first, but as she scrolled through, Claire saw the affection, the flirtation that had been hidden behind David's lies. There were texts between him and Laura, messages filled with declarations of longing, plans to meet in secret, and words that Claire had never imagined David would say to another woman. The pain of seeing those words on the screen was indescribable, but it was also a cold wake-up call. She had suspected something, but seeing the truth laid out in front of her was something else entirely. Her husband, the man she had trusted with her heart, had betrayed her in the worst possible way. Tears filled Claire's eyes as she stood in the kitchen, her heart shattering with each word she read. She couldn't comprehend it. How could David, the man she had spent years with, the father of their children, have done this to her? The shock was overwhelming, but there was also a sharp sense of anger rising within her. How long had this been going on? How many times had he lied to her face, pretending that everything was fine while secretly building a life with another woman? Claire didn't know what to do with this new knowledge. She felt sick to her stomach, as if the ground beneath her was slipping away. But as the initial wave of shock faded, a sense of resolve began to take its place. She couldn't just ignore this. She had to confront David, to demand answers, even if it meant tearing their lives apart. It wasn't just the affair that hurt her. It was the fact that David had never once trusted her enough to be honest. He had betrayed her in the worst way possible, and now she had to face the consequences of his actions. That night, when David came home late as usual, Claire didn't wait for him to slip into bed and pretend everything was normal. She was already waiting for him, her face pale, her eyes burning with a mixture of hurt and fury. She had to confront him now, had to get the answers that had eluded her for so long. There was no more pretending, no more silence. The truth had been exposed, and it was time for everything to come to light. The night Claire confronted David was one she would never forget, a night that would forever change the course of their lives. The tension in the room was palpable, thick with the weight of unspoken words, and a growing sense of betrayal that hung between them like a dark cloud. David walked in, as he had so many nights before, weary from a long day at the studio. He didn't expect to find Claire waiting for him, sitting in the dimly lit living room, her face a mixture of determination and pain. There was no warmth in her eyes, no soft smile to greet him as usual. The air was heavy with anticipation, as though both of them knew that everything was about to unravel. Claire had already made up her mind. She wasn't going to let him slip away this time, not with more lies and empty excuses. She had seen the truth, felt it deep in her bones, and now there was no turning back. When David entered the room, Claire stood up, her hands trembling but her voice steady. "David," she said, her voice sharp, "we need to talk." David paused for a moment, sensing the gravity of the situation. His eyes flickered with confusion, but the guilt that had been simmering beneath the surface of their marriage for months now began to surface. He knew something was wrong, but he wasn't prepared for the storm Claire was about to unleash. Claire didn't give him a chance to speak. Instead, she took out his phone, the phone he had left carelessly on the kitchen counter, and showed him the messages. Her fingers shook as she scrolled through the texts between him and Laura, each word like a dagger to her heart. She didn't need to say anything. The evidence was there, staring him in the face. He could no longer hide behind the mask of innocence. David's face drained of color as he saw the messages. The words that he had once thought were hidden safely away now laid bare before them both. The playful, flirtatious tones, the planning of secret meetings. He could see how it must have felt to Claire, how it must have felt like a betrayal of everything they had built together. The silence stretched between them as David struggled for words, his mind racing to find an excuse, a justification. But nothing came. His mouth felt dry, and for the first time in a long while, he couldn't look Claire in the eye. I didn't mean for it to happen this way, David muttered, his voice weak and defensive. It just happened. Claire's anger flared at his words. It just happened. The betrayal, the lies, the deceit. It had all just happened. She had been a fool to ignore the signs for so long. She had believed in their marriage, in their life together, and David had shattered all of it with his selfish actions. You didn't mean for it to happen, Claire repeated, her voice trembling with emotion. You didn't mean for this to happen, David. You didn't mean to hurt me, to tear our family apart. Her voice cracked on the last word, the weight of her pain nearly too much to bear. David opened his mouth to respond, but the words caught in his throat. How could he explain the unexplainable? How could he tell her that, in the midst of his affair with Laura, he had justified every lie, every moment of distance, because he had convinced himself that Claire didn't care, that she didn't see him anymore? How could he admit that for a fleeting moment, the excitement of the affair had made him feel alive in a way he hadn't felt in years? It was too late for explanations. Claire wasn't listening to his excuses. She was listening to the truth that had been hidden from her for so long. The room grew colder, the silence stretching out like an eternity. Claire's eyes were filled with hurt, but also something else. Resolve. She had spent too many years believing in their marriage, in the man she had married. But now she realized she had been living in a fantasy. David wasn't the man she thought he was, and the reality of his betrayal hit her like a crushing wave. I want you to leave, Claire said, her voice low but firm.
I can't do this anymore, David. I can't pretend that everything is okay when I know it isn't. I trusted you, and you broke that trust. David's heart sank. He hadn't expected this, not really. He thought that maybe, after the confrontation,
Claire would forgive him, that she would see past the affair and understand that it had been a mistake. But Claire wasn't asking for forgiveness. She was asking for her dignity, for the truth, for closure. Please, Claire, David whispered, stepping forward, his voice laced with desperation. I'm sorry. I was wrong. Please, don't. But Claire had already made up her mind. She couldn't go back. She had been broken by his actions, by the lies he had told her and the secrets he had kept hidden. She turned away, not wanting to see him any longer, not wanting to hear his empty promises. The pain in her chest was suffocating, but it was nothing compared to the betrayal that had shattered her world. The days that followed were a blur of emotions for both Claire and David. Their once solid life had disintegrated, leaving behind a cold emptiness that neither of them knew how to fill. David moved out of the house the following morning, his bags hastily packed, his mind in turmoil. The weight of his actions bore down on him with a suffocating pressure. He had made a mistake, a catastrophic mistake, but there was no turning back now. Claire, though devastated, found herself unexpectedly numb. The rage and hurt from the night of the confrontation had slowly faded into a deep, quiet sorrow. She had cried for hours, but now, in the silence of her empty house, she felt strangely calm. It was as if she had already grieved the death of her marriage before it had even ended. The questions swirled endlessly in her mind. How had she missed the signs for so long? How could David have lied to her face day after day and still come home, pretending to be the husband she thought? She knew the betrayal was profound, but the deeper wound was the realization that her trust had been shattered beyond repair. Over the next few weeks, the couple lived in separate worlds. Claire threw herself into her work, focusing on her students and the routines of daily life. She kept herself busy, her mind always buzzing with a new task, a new distraction. But in the quiet moments, when she was alone with her thoughts, she felt the sting of her loss. The house, once filled with the sounds of her family, now felt hollow and foreign. She found herself searching for answers that David could never give her, questioning everything she thought she knew about love, loyalty, and herself. It was hard to let go of the man she had shared so much of her life with, even though he had betrayed her in the worst possible way. But she knew she couldn't continue to hold on to the ghost of their marriage. She had to move forward, even if it meant walking away from the past she had built with him. David, meanwhile, struggled to come to terms with the fallout of his affair. The relationship with Laura had ended as suddenly as it had begun. Once the affair had been exposed, Laura distanced herself from him, no longer interested in continuing a relationship with a man who had destroyed his marriage. David was left, alone, adrift, with no one to turn to for comfort. He tried to reach out to Claire, calling and texting, apologizing over and over, but she remained distant, refusing to engage in anything more than the bare minimum. She had made her decision. He had lost everything, his marriage, his family, and in the end, his dignity. The man he had been was now a stranger, and in its place was a man full of regret, shame, and a deep sense of loneliness. He had been so consumed by his affair, by the excitement and escape it provided, that he hadn't realized the damage he was doing until it was too late. And now, as he sat alone in his new, unfamiliar apartment, David understood just how much he had destroyed. One evening, weeks after the confrontation, Claire received a call from David. His voice, once confident and commanding, now sounded small and broken, a shadow of the man she had once loved. He asked if they could meet, just to talk. No expectations, no drama, just a chance for him to express his regret. Claire hesitated, the pain still raw, but something in his voice made her agree. She needed closure, she realized, more than anything. She needed to hear him admit what he had done, to hear him truly understand the weight of his actions. They met at a quiet cafe, the kind of place they used to go to when they were still in love. The irony wasn't lost on Claire. David looked different, older, wearier, with an emptiness in his eyes that made her heart ache for him, but also for the person he had become. They sat across from each other, the awkward silence hanging heavy between them. Neither knew where to start, but eventually David spoke, his words tentative. "I'm sorry, Claire, I'm so sorry for everything," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "I don't expect you to forgive me, but I need you to know that what I did was the biggest mistake of my life. I never meant to hurt you. I never meant to destroy everything we had." Claire stared at him, her emotions a whirlwind inside her. She had heard these words before, too many times, but this time they seemed different. He wasn't asking for forgiveness. He was simply acknowledging the truth of what he had done. It didn't change anything, but it was a start. "I don't know how to forgive you, David," Claire replied, her voice quiet but firm. I don't know if I ever will. You broke something that can't be fixed. I thought I knew who you were, and now I realize I didn't. But I'm trying to move forward. For me, for the kids, for our future. I can't keep looking back at what we lost.